fundamental issue now before our people can be stated free. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not.
I believe in the American Constitution. I favor the American system of individual enterprise. I am in favor of protection. I believe in the permanent court and further limitation of armament. I am opposed to aggressive war.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Whether we shape the future in the image of our hopes is ours is to determine by our actions and our choices. If we succeed, generations to come will say of us now living that we mastered our moment.
Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo.
Putting America first. This is The Right Take.
Hello, everybody. How is it going? You guys feeling good? We sure are feeling good here today at The Right Take, more so than usual. Welcome, one and all, to episode number 68 of The Right Take. I am Eric Lendrum, here with my co-host Jacob Grandstaff. He is back after a couple weeks hiatus. Thanks again so much to my buddy Patrick Von Hanslick for filling in as a guest fill-in host. And also, of course, thank you to Jack Hatfield of Valiant News for doing an interview with us in the previous episode where we got to go on some righteous rants about Fox News going full trans. So that was a great episode. Be sure to check that out if you guys haven't already. But Jacob is back in the saddle. We are back at it again, and what an episode to come back to. You guys already know what we're talking about. This is we'll pretty much dive right on into this. Let's give some opening thoughts first, Jacob, on this historic occasion before we do the little obligatory election recap that we always do. Jacob, how are you feeling, my man?
I'm feeling not just victorious, but vindictive, and we have to make sure that we push our advantage, because it's funny, because for years conservatives argued there's no point in voting. You know, we elected Republicans and they never got Roe v. Wade overturned. They put Republicans on the Supreme Court and they voted in Casey to uphold Roe v. Wade. Well, this shows that persistence pays off.
Exactly. It pays off, and it was a long, hard road to get here. 49 years, and I think the number stands at about 63 million aborted babies during that time, but we finally got here. And I, of course, have my thoughts on it. We're going to talk about that. We're going to be reacting to some clips, some legendary clips, colossal salt mines from the left, from elected Democrats, naturally. But before we do that, we have to talk of one more aspect of elections recently I had to talk about, and I had to get your input on this as well, Jacob. So the last 2 weeks in a row now, we've had a handful of more interesting primaries here and there. We had Nevada, which is a pretty big swing state, one of the states that I think could very well determine control of the U.S. Senate this November. It was a clean sweep for President Trump's endorsements. In the gubernatorial primary, Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo easily won the nomination with Trump's endorsement, as did former Attorney General Adam Laxalt, who won the nomination for the U.S. Senate seat. Again, this is one of the handful of realistic pickup opportunities that Republicans have in November, so this is definitely a race worth keeping an eye on. One other thing we had to talk about. We talked about before about how Joe Biden's endorsement record has not been great. I think he is 0 for 1 so far. I know he endorsed Congressman Kurt Schrader over in Oregon, who then lost his primary. We talked about that. But someone else who is also not doing well, someone who, again, funny this happened in Nevada, someone else who would also have really bad luck in a casino, I think, just like Joe Biden, is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, notice he seems to have been all but politically neutered at this point since Biden came to power. We don't really hear from him anymore, but he and the AOC wing and the Justice Democrats, the Young Turks and whatnot, they still try to throw out their endorsements every now and then. And Bernie made an endorsement in the 1st congressional district. Democrat Congresswoman there, Dina Titus, was challenged by a radical socialized medicine activist who was endorsed by Bernie named Amy Villela, who got destroyed by a 60-point margin, folks. 79.9% for Titus to 20.1% for Villela. So that is just a truly outstanding landslide for the incumbent against Bernie's choice. Once again, it needs to be said, the campaign slogan of Bernie Sanders' entire political career should be no refunds. No refunds whatsoever, folks. Don't try your luck too much at the slot machines, Bernie. South Carolina, unfortunately, was a bit of a mixed bag for President Trump. In the 1st congressional district, you have Nancy Mace, a hardcore anti-Trumper who leaked text messages and conversations revealed she was trash-talking Trump right after January 6th, basically blaming him for the insurrection, whatever, so she's a real winner. President Trump endorsed a woman by the name of Katie Arrington to challenge her. Now, what's important here is that for this particular district, Katie Arrington famously was the nominee in 2018 when she ousted incumbent Congressman Mark Sanford. Does that name sound familiar? Former governor of South Carolina. He represented that district, and then he was ousted in the primary. He then ran against Trump. He was one of the 3 stooges who ran against Trump in the Republican primaries in 2020 and got absolutely 0 votes to show for it. Katie Arrington won that nomination, again, and this is a very red seat. And then shortly after the primary, she was involved in a very nasty car crash that left her completely incapacitated for the rest of the campaign. She was off the campaign trail and narrowly lost the general election as a result to the Democrat in that race, who was a Democrat by the name of Joe Cunningham. And he even then only barely beat her by like 1% or so, which she was completely off the campaign trail. So had it not been for that car crash, obviously she would have won the election easily, would be the congresswoman from that district. But Joe Cunningham was elected. He then was defeated in 2020 by Nancy Mace. So Katie Arrington essentially was trying to stage a comeback here with Trump's support, but ultimately it was not enough, and she lost by about 8 points, 53% to 45%. But on the other side of the state, in District 7, this was a huge deal. Tom Rice, a congressman who was one of the 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump in the 2nd impeachment trial, he got bulldozed. I mean, he got wiped off the face of the political map. Trump endorsed a state legislator there by the name of Russell Fry, who challenged him, and Fry got 51.1% of the vote to Rice's 24.6%, more than twice as many votes as what Rice got against an incumbent congressman, which is so much, by the way. South Carolina is one of those runoff states. Fry avoided a runoff entirely and won the nomination outright, and he's now going to be the next congressman from this seat. Again, a very red seat. So that is one down. I think that's half of the pro-impeachment Republicans who are gone now, who I think the previous 4 all announced that they were just not going to run for re-election. And then you have Fry here defeating Rice. So that's 5 right there. So 5 down, 5 to go. So that was a huge victory for President Trump. Over in Alabama, we've been talking a lot about this one, the U.S. Senate race there. Of course, President Trump infamously rescinded his endorsement for Mo Brooks, and then ultimately Katie Britt and Mo Brooks went to the runoff. Trump announced his support for Katie Britt, who, no big surprise, won the nomination 63% to Brooks' 37%. So let's go ahead and call that kind of a half win for Trump. He pulled back his original endorsement, but then made an endorsement for the other candidate, who then went on to win. Kind of like what happened in Pennsylvania. He was forced to withdraw his support for Sean Parnell. He then endorsed Dr. Oz, who went on to win the nomination. So we'll count that ultimately as a win for President Trump. And then one last thing I want to talk about, and I want to use this to segue into a mini discussion I want to have with you, Jacob. Georgia. There was one big runoff election from this state in the 10th congressional district, where famously Vernon Jones, remember him, former black state legislator from Georgia, who formerly was a Democrat, who was a Democrat for his entire life, and then announced his switching to the Republican Party in support of President Trump. He spoke at the Republican National Convention in 2020, And then he initially ran for governor against Brian Kemp, but ultimately withdrew from the race when President Trump endorsed David Perdue. And with Trump's backing, Jones jumped into the 10th congressional district, which was Jody Hice's old seat before Jody Hice stepped down to run against Brad Raffensperger for Secretary of State. Unfortunately, as we know, neither of those ended up working out. But Jones ran. He managed to come in second in the primary behind Mac Collins, who was the son of a former congressman. And they ultimately advanced to the runoff. And when I saw that they called the race with just 35% in, that's how you know it's really bad. Matt Collins ended up winning 74.5% to Jones's 25.5%. A complete blowout. Jones was destroyed, and that was another endorsement from President Trump. So that now brings it to, for the year 2022, 9 primary losses for President Trump, which is, again, almost twice as many as he had over the course of the entire first 5 years of his political career. And it's interesting to note that 5 of those 9 are all from the state of Georgia. We talked about the 4 statewide offices in the previous Georgia primaries, and now we have Vernon Jones here in the runoff. So there's something I did want to talk about briefly. I actually wrote an article for this about this for American Greatness, and that's this claim that they're really using Georgia to highlight this. The claim that Democrats are the reason for this. Democrats are taking credit for Trump's endorsements losing in these elections because apparently something they're doing in some states where it is legal is Democrats are switching to Republican just to vote in the Republican primaries against Trump's candidates. And they're taking credit for this in Georgia, maybe not necessarily in the Vernon Jones race, but the statewide races. Although a study, as reported by the Associated Press, a study shows about 37,000 Georgia Democrats who voted in the primaries, in the original primaries, Brian Kemp versus David Perdue, all that stuff, which I see that number. And of course, that means absolutely nothing because Brian Kemp beat Perdue by over 620,000 votes. Brad Raffensperger beat Jody Hice by 220,000 votes. So clearly, those were not enough to swing the outcomes of the elections. But nevertheless, you're seeing the mainstream media running around, Democrats are still winning. Democrats are still beating the orange man. And my take on this, before I get your input, Jacob, my take on this is that this is Democrats just coping. This doesn't really mean anything. This is just desperate to take credit for any kind of victory to show that somehow they're still pulling the strings and they're still going to win in November. But I think this is just a total nothing burger that the mainstream media is just putting out there to make Democrats feel better about the crises that are just mounting up against them right now. Jacob, what do you think?
That is purely CNN driven because I tuned into CNN one night when I was in a hotel room. That's the only time that I'll ever watch CNN. There's just nothing else on. But this was during the West Virginia and Nebraska primaries. Mm-hmm. And of course, Trump went 1-1 that night. And CNN, rather than talk about the candidates, rather than talk about the races, they spent hours and hours and hours. I would tune in and out like over the course of 4 or 5 hours, and they continually talked about Trump's record, his endorsement record. That's all they talked about. They made everything about Trump. So the Democratic Party, they've been very clear that they're not interested in discussing issues. They're only interested in throwing red meat to their base, which is just absolutely anti-Trump, and that's really all they care about is humiliating Donald Trump. So for them, all that matters is Trump's win-loss record. It's almost a sport. It's basically a sport for them. Yeah. So if Trump has losses in his endorsements, then they're going to immediately claim credit for that rather than point out how much spending was put in, like for Georgia and Alabama, for instance, how much money went into those races to influence the outcome. I think Katie Britt would have easily cruised to victory whether Trump had endorsed her or not. He didn't even need to jump into the Alabama Senate race. But in Georgia particularly, the people he endorsed, they didn't have much money, and he wasn't willing to put a bunch of his money behind them. So Georgia was kind of a throwaway. But I do think.
And they were going, as we said in the previous episode, they were going up against the state party apparatus as well. They were going up against incumbents like Kemp and Raffensperger, which just stacked the odds against them even more.
Exactly, yeah. In Alabama, Katie Britt had the state apparatus behind her. So the thing is, and I've talked about this before, how in the South, the state apparatus, the party apparatus really does run the state with an iron fist. So if you want to influence the state, you really have to sit down with the good old boys in the state party apparatus and get them on your side. Now, back in South Carolina, Nancy Mace, she very narrowly defeated the Trump-backed challenger. And I think that's important. I think a lot of people expected that to be a blowout because she had the backing of Nikki Haley. She had a lot of big establishment donors behind her. I think people figured she was going to erase Arrington by 20 to 30 points. And the fact that Arrington made it so close just shows how much of a vindictive spirit there is out there to avenge Trump for the Republicans who stabbed him in the back. Now, Mace didn't vote for impeachment. If she had voted for impeachment, she would have lost.
Yeah, just like Tom Rice did.
With Tom Wolf. Or Tom Rice.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, like you said, yeah, that definitely shows that Trump's endorsement power still carries more weight than it doesn't. I think the latest I heard from Breitbart is that now, for the year 2022 alone, his endorsement record, he has over 130 victories now against 9 losses, which is still insanely good. Again, that's certainly better than Joe Biden's record this year or Bernie Sanders' record this year. It works more often than it doesn't. You look at the other success stories. J.D. Vance in Ohio, he was polling at 3rd, 4th place in the primary. Trump endorses him. He shoots him into 1st place and wins the nomination in a landslide. Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. Oz literally would not have been competitive had it not been for Trump's support. It was a squeaker. It was a very, very narrow squeaker there, but he ended up pulling it off. North Carolina, remember President Trump endorsed Ted Budd, the congressman, who was running against the former governor, Pat McCrory. And even at the time of Trump's endorsement and a little while after the endorsement, Budd was still down by 20, 30 points in all the polls before he turned it around and then won that nomination in a landslide. You look at, I talked about this with Jack Hatfield. Arizona, Trump just announced his support for Blake Masters, and now Blake Masters is leading the polls and is now the favorite to win. More often than not, his endorsement will carry people over the finish line. It will destroy incumbents. You saw that happen to Tom Rice. We're going to be keeping an eye on the future very soon here. In Washington State, we've got the really famous showdown between Jamie Herrera Butler and Joe Kent, where Kent has Trump's support and is currently leading in all the polls right now. You're seeing disagreeing narratives within the left. They can't even agree amongst themselves with what they want, because I saw some articles saying that in certain races, Democrats are crossing over to vote Republican to vote for Trump's candidates because they think, oh, the Trump candidates are crazy and they're definitely going to lose the general election. Doug Mastriano, the nominee for governor of Pennsylvania, is one example. They said, oh, he's an election denier. He's crazy. Of course he'll lose to Josh Shapiro. So they turn around and claim they voted for Trump's guy. So, like, okay, do you want Trump's guys to win because you think they'll lose the general? Or do you want them to lose the primary despite Trump? Like, they can't even agree, which, again, just shows how dysfunctional they are. They have no clear message and no clear direction going forward because they know this is going to be a slaughter for them in November. There's no getting around that.
But they're so convinced that everyone agrees with them on politics and Trump and the so-called insurrection. So that's why they assume, well, if we get a Trump candidate in there, it's a slam dunk for the Democrat.
Exactly. But then, plot twist when the Trump endorsed Republican actually ends up winning. Can you imagine, again, if Doug Mastriano were to win that election and become governor of Pennsylvania, he would make Ron DeSantis look like a rhino. He would be an absolutely base Republican. His Wikipedia article describes him as a Christian nationalist, all right? Which is, that sounds pretty great, especially given what just happened with Roe v. Wade. So we will be coming back very soon. The next round of primaries coming up real soon here, guys. A handful of interesting ones, including Colorado, where leftists are targeting Lauren Boebert now. They're claiming the same group that takes credit for beating Madison Cawthorn is now trying to go after Lauren Boebert and beat her in a primary, so we'll see how that goes. Illinois, we're going to have 3 different districts with incumbent on incumbent violence because Illinois lost a district in the census, so a handful of incumbents got smashed into the same district together, so they're forced to run against each other on both sides, Democrat and Republican. And we will also have New York. There's an interesting primary there for governor between Congressman Lee Zeldin and Rudy Giuliani's son, Andrew Giuliani, and also another seat. That's the one where there's one district where Jerry Nadler is running against another Democrat, Carolyn Maloney, 2 incumbents, where we could see the little 4-foot-tall goblin lose his primary. So that will be truly hilarious if that is how it goes down. So we will be coming back next week to talk about that. But let's move on, Jacob. There's nothing else to talk about. Roe v. Wade is dead. 49 years too late, in my opinion. It should have come a lot sooner, but hey, better late than ever before. And I just got to start off with this. We have to talk about, of course, we have to acknowledge who is the most responsible for this. There's a lot of credit that deserves to go around here, of course, to the 5 justices, the 6 justices, actually. When I saw that Chief Justice John Roberts joined the majority, I was just like, what? He finally did something not cringe and cucked for once? Color me shocked. But we gotta give credit, of course, to the justices who held the line even after the leaking of the initial draft written by Justice Alito. They did not back down, and the actual final release version of the draft of the opinion was very similar to the leaked draft. So they basically did not budge even after all the protests and the doxing of their homes and a crazy guy from California flying all the way to Maryland just to try to assassinate Justice Kavanaugh. They held the line and they did it. Knowing that there was going to be backlash, they did it anyway. So props to the justices. But of course, Jacob, credit where credit is due. You and I both know the one man who is most responsible for this glorious day happening is President Donald Trump.
Yeah, and so this is one thing that the Never Trumpers don't have a leg to stand on, because I've seen several articles in conservative media this past week pointing out this is what we were talking about. The politics are more important than the man's personality. And so the Never Trumpers, if everyone had taken their advice, Trump would have never been elected president, and Roe v. Wade would still be the law of the land. And the interesting thing is, a lot of those Never Trumpers are very staunchly pro-life, and they're very staunchly anti-Roe v. Wade. So yeah, this completely debunks the whole Never Trump fiasco.
Exactly, because they always said, like, oh, Trump's not really a conservative. They try to claim he's not the second coming of Ronald Reagan. He's a moderate New York liberal. Can you just imagine being a time traveler and going back in time 10 years, the year 2012 at this point, and telling people that Donald Trump will be the man who gets Roe v. Wade overturned? Can you just imagine? And yet, sure enough, here we are. 10 years later, that's exactly what happened. But yes, he ultimately promised, he predicted this actually in one of his debates with Hillary Clinton. He predicted that if he got elected president, he would make sure Roe v. Wade was overturned. And that is exactly what happened. He got to pick 3 Supreme Court justices in one term, because again, you had the seat left open by the death of Antonin Scalia, which he then filled. You had Justice Kennedy, the swing vote, retiring to be replaced by Kavanaugh. And then, of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who stubbornly refused to retire when Obama and everyone else was begging her to quit while Obama was still president so another leftist could be appointed to take her place. She wouldn't do it, and then she died right before the end of Trump's first term, and we got the notorious ACB, Amy Coney Barrett. And yeah, this never would have happened if Hillary had been president, obviously. This never would have happened if anyone else was the nominee, because no one else would have beaten Hillary Clinton. And it needs to be said, like you said, yeah, the politics, the policies matter more than the man's personality. I think it definitely needs to be said now at this point with this victory, because as we said previously, is there a single greater conservative victory in the last 50 years, 60 years even? No, there isn't. This is, along with guns, I think this is one of the definitive issues that unites pretty much all Republicans and all conservatives. And Donald Trump made this historic day happen. He is officially a more conservative and greater overall Republican president than even Ronald Reagan was. Reagan never made this happen. Reagan was president when Roe v. Wade was, the law of the land. He could have done something with his justices. No, he gave us Justice Kennedy, who made gay marriage legal. At the end of the day, this beats that argument that, Reagan was the conservative gold standard. No, Donald Trump is the new gold standard of American conservative, the greatest Republican president in modern history, and I do think one of the greatest presidents of all time. And this victory that he had, he is not even in office anymore, and he is still winning, and Biden can't rack up a win to save his life. Truly a great day, a great historic achievement, and it's all thanks to President Trump.
Well, one thing I want to point out about Reagan is it's true that Reagan was pro-life, and he did put 2 justices on the court. But with Reagan, it was very similar to Trump. Like, Trump didn't make abortion a litmus test. He put people on who he thought were going to be strict constructionists, just as Reagan did. The problem is, at the time, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, but at the time, the justices were more concerned about public opinion than they were about doing their jobs, which is what we saw in the Casey case. At Casey, it should have been overturned then in 1992. That's when Sandra Day O'Connor and Kennedy should have voted to overturn Roe v. Wade at the time. But I just want to jump into what Alito's statement on this in his majority opinion. And we did another episode on this a couple of podcasts back. We went into how the constitutional process works with judicial review. They first look at the Constitution and legal precedent, and if there's nothing there, then they look at English common law, because the Constitution came after English common law. So Alito writes, guided by the history and tradition that map the essential components of the nation's concept of ordered liberty, the court finds the 14th Amendment clearly does not protect the right to an abortion. Until the latter part of the 20th century, there was no support in American law for a constitutional right to obtain abortion. This is what we pointed out, that starting with the Civil War, and I'm not going to read all of it, but he points out that when the 14th Amendment was enacted, 2/3 of the states had laws on the books that made abortion illegal in all cases. So it's very clearly not a constitutional right when they enacted the 14th Amendment. And the thing is, liberals don't even try to pretend that that's the case. Like, liberals will never make pro-choice liberals will never make the argument that it's a fundamental facet of English common law that abortion was supposed to be legal, or that abortion was legal at the time of the adoption of the 14th Amendment. Instead, they tried to make the argument that you should expand equality and expand rights, and that should be the benchmark of a good justice system rather than following the Constitution.
And a lot more was hinted at in this ruling in reference to other rulings that might be revisited now through this precedence of this case. Again, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization is the name of the full case, so we'll just call it Dobbs. But before we do that, what better way to react to this than to react to the reactions from the left? Jacob, I'll let you pick, my man. We have a handful of clips here of top Democrats reacting, just coping and seething in response to this. We've got Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, Maxine Waters, and Chris Coons. Who do you want to hear from first, Jacob?
Oh, Maxine Waters. Maxine Waters, definitely.
All right. So this is outside the Supreme Court. Here's Maxine Waters after the announcement of the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
You see this turnout here? You ain't seen nothing yet. Women are going to control their bodies no matter how they try and stop us. The hell with the Supreme Court. We will defy them. Women will be in control of their bodies. And if they think black women are intimidated or afraid, they got another thought coming. Black women will be out in droves. We will be out by the thousands. We will be out by the millions.
We will be out by the thousands and millions. Jacob, does that sound a bit maybe like a threat to insurrection there to you?
Well, the Washington Post actually subtly endorsed this kind of behavior, because I read an article where they pointed out that the justices, despite all of the public outroar and even threats against their life, they still stubbornly persisted in overturning Roe v. Wade, which suggests that they actually agree with threats against the justices' lives if it forces them to change their opinion. So
yeah, absolutely. It's endorsed by, all the leading figures of the Democratic Party. They're all on board with this. And of course, it's Maxine Waters, the same one who basically called her supporters to surround and harass and threaten, Trump administration officials if they see them in person, at restaurants and whatnot. And one more thing about that video I just got to mention before we move on. There's a huge mountain of a man standing behind her that you think is one of her bodyguards. But then I recognize him. He's wearing a mask. It's not one of her bodyguards or staffers. It's Congressman Al Green, the black congressman in Texas who when Trump took office immediately, he wanted to impeach
Trump for being elected.
Impeach Trump for being elected right off the bat. Day one, he introduced articles of impeachment. The guy who, by the way, he looks like the same way in this video too. He's got this ugly, unruly beard, this unkempt, unshaven, unclean beard. He's got a long ponytail. He honestly, I remember a friend of mine said it very well. He looks like if you took a homeless man and plucked him off the street, put him in an ill-fitting suit, and put him in the halls of Congress. That's what he looks like. He looks just so unclean, unshaven, unprofessional, and he just thinks, oh, that's just my style, but he just looks so unprofessional. But that really is to be expected from Democrats at this point. We've got to talk about Nancy Pelosi, who is just, she sounds so deflated and defeated, and it's glorious. Here's one clip. We got two clips here. Here's the first one.
Clearly, we hope that the Supreme Court would open its eyes. But to see the Chief Justice side with this radical agenda, it's just stunning. And again, as a woman, as a mother, as a grandmother, to see young girls now have fewer rights than their moms or even their grandmothers is something very sad for our country.
Yeah, fewer rights in the sense that you no longer have the right to kill babies. Yes, they do have fewer rights, Nancy, and that is a good thing. That is a good thing that this right does not exist anymore. It never should have been a right. You don't have a right to kill babies just because you don't want it or because it's inconvenient or whatever. You don't want a baby because it's inconvenient? Be responsible. That's all that needs to be said. That's really what it's all about at the end of the day. It's responsibility. It's taking responsibility for their actions and dealing with the potential consequences. That's what they cannot stand. That's what this ruling is all about. And they hate it. It drives them nuts. This was basically one of the pillars of maintaining the sexual revolution and this world without consequences that the left built up for themselves out of the hippie generations. No more. And that is all the more delicious for it.
One thing that she's alluding to here is that women and girls are now having a constitutional right taken away from them, which is something that you're going to see repeated over and over again. And as we all know, the Supreme Court, right before they overturned Roe, they also ruled that you can carry a firearm in public. They struck down New York's law. And it's incredible. Even Obama's former Solicitor General was making this argument that the Supreme Court is saying that states' rights don't apply to guns, but they do apply to abortion. But they're not taken into account. There is no fundamental argument that states' rights are final. The argument for states' rights is that whatever it's 10th Amendment, 10th
Yes.
Amendment absolutism. Anything that isn't explicitly given to the federal government is then delegated to the states. Well, the Second Amendment is a federal amendment.
Yes.
So the states obviously can't violate the Second Amendment. If the right to abortion was a part of the Bill of Rights, then obviously, yes, states wouldn't be able to outlaw abortion. This is the thing they don't understand. If you talk to the average liberal, they hear sound bites and then they hear talking points, and they match the talking points with the sound bites, and they don't really know. They don't know what we believe. And this is a thing that I've heard often is that conservatives know what liberals believe, but liberals don't know what conservatives believe. And therein lies the great chasm in this country between the right and left.
Exactly. And it's also a matter of adherence to the Constitution, which they, of course, don't support. They don't think we should be able to follow the Constitution. The Constitution was written by a bunch of old white guys in the 1700s. Therefore, it's illegitimate. Their opinions don't matter because they were white men, and there were no Native Americans. There were no black people at the signing of the Declaration of Independence or whatever. But sorry, the Constitution is the law of the land for a reason.
Well, see, used to they wouldn't even say that part out loud. Like if you go back 10, 20, 30 years, they wouldn't say that out loud. They would say that in the classroom. Legal professors would say that. But this is a professor at Georgetown, Louis Michael Seidman. He says he writes the long troubled history of the Supreme Court and how we can change it. He writes, it's time to admit that the nation's highest court has been a source of harm more often than it's been a force for justice. By now, it should be abundantly clear that our antiquated Constitution, written over 2 centuries ago by white men to govern a small slave-dependent republic huddled along the eastern seaboard, does not meet the needs of the sprawling, multi-ethnic, complicated country that we have become. And he completely tries to delegitimize the court. He points out certain things about past justices' personal flaws that they had, as if everyone doesn't have personal flaws. Like one of them ended up going insane early, and they kept it on the court. Little things that it was really up to Congress. Okay, well that was the Congress's mistake. It wasn't the Constitution. Congress could have removed that justice. But you scroll down to the bottom, and you find out that he is a scholar of critical legal theory.
Oh, of course.
This is the critical legal theory, of course, is the basis of critical race theory. Critical legal theory preceded critical race theory. And so this is true with especially a lot of black academics, especially HBCUs. But this guy is even at Georgetown Law. They don't believe we're training lawyers who are being trained to believe that our Constitution is illegitimate because it was created by white, old, plantation-owning, slave-holding white men, and that the Republic was dependent on slavery. But yeah, they don't believe the Constitution at all. They believe we should completely scrap the Constitution, delegitimize the court. And one last thing on this guy, one thing that Seidler mentions, some of the arguments he makes are some of the arguments that conservatives made to criticize the Supreme Court back when the Supreme Court was being judiciously activist in favor of the left. If you remember, a lot of times we would argue they shouldn't serve lifetime appointments. They should have, a 10-year term, a 20-year term, and then be replaced. That's something that conservatives agree with. But now that the court isn't ruling in the left's favor, now the left is coming around to the points that the right has been making for years, that the Supreme Court has too much power, that they should have term limits. But they're not for states' rights when it comes to school choice and things such as that.
That's why part of our intro, every time we play that historical intro, we play the part of Calvin Coolidge saying part of his platform is he believes in the permanent court. And the permanent court, because it is one of the few institutions left that is not beholden to the will of the public. It is not beholden to voters. It's not beholden to certain politicians in office. I mean, again, in the case of the Supreme Court, yeah, the Senate confirms these a lot of these judicial nominees at the federal level as well. But they are still largely free to make these decisions without, being impeached or whatever. And that is important, that there is at least one branch that is not going to just do what they do because, the voters may or may not like it. In this case, they did something that was, arguably, this is something that is more popular. Again, the pro-life position has been gaining more support over the last 10, 15 years or so now. I think there are more pro-life people in this country than there are pro-abortion people. But, of course, you have the rioters and the protesters who make it seem like this is the unpopular thing to do, but they're just trying to intimidate the justices. And, again, thankfully, it did not work. We got to go back to some salt here.
Yeah, we're going to...
Oh, go ahead.
Just one quick note. We're going to include this in the show notes, but, you're seeing a lot of polls now, Gallup and others are showing that it's like 35% of the country agrees with the Supreme Court, 30% of the country doesn't support Roe v. Wade. But if you actually dig into the data, and we're going to include this in the show notes, it's actually over 2/3 of the country that believes in some restrictions on abortion. When they ask people, what they're doing is they're basically taking the small minority that doesn't believe in any restriction on abortion, and they're saying that's the pro-life crowd, the entire pro-life movement. People are only 25% of the country. But if you dig into the data, it's like 2/3 to 3/4 that actually don't want abortion to be legal past the first trimester. And what's interesting, I didn't know this actually until I was preparing for this podcast, but the Roe v. Wade regime in the United States was more liberal than every single country in the European Union except for the Netherlands. Almost no countries in Europe allow abortion for any reason past the first trimester. And even in the UK, where Boris Johnson claimed that this decision was going to set back people around the world, and because he's against this decision to overturn Roe, even in the UK, it's illegal to have an abortion past the first trimester unless you have a really good reason to have an abortion, such as your health is at risk. So Europe, even as liberal as they are far more conservative on the abortion issue than America was under Roe v. Wade.
That is really encouraging, too. I was not aware of that fact. But yeah, it just goes to show that when arguably the most pro-abortion regime, like you said, finally collapses, and there now really is no safe haven for abortion anywhere in the world, that is a beautiful thing. That is a great thing. Again, infanticide should be made illegal again, and this goes a long way towards that. Going back to the SALT, we've got to react to a segment of Joe Biden's speech, because Biden, of course, gave a speech off of teleprompter. Obviously, they shot him up full of meds so he wouldn't be too, off his rocker. And here is just a clip of that.
Make no mistake, this decision is a culmination of a deliberate effort over decades to upset balance of our law. It's a realization of an extreme ideology and a tragic error by the Supreme Court, in my view. The court has done what it has never done before, expressly take away a constitutional right that is so fundamental to so many Americans that had already been recognized.
Again, I wasn't aware it was an extreme ideology to not support killing babies, Jacob, but apparently that's an extreme position now. But there it is again.
Catholic joke.
Exactly. Yeah, so-called Catholic. Are you joking me? Yeah, it's no wonder people want him, excommunicated and not be able to receive communion and whatnot. But it's there it is again. He said it's a fundamental constitutional right, even though it is not in the Constitution, as we have already said, and as the court itself ruled. Wanted to go back to Pelosi. Pelosi had, this is an even funnier one, where she does her best to give credit where credit is due for why this decision ultimately finally happened.
Today, the Republican-controlled Supreme Court has achieved their dark, extreme goal of ripping away a woman's right to make their own reproductive health decisions. Because of Donald Trump, Mitch McConnell, and the Republican Party, their supermajority in the Supreme Court, American women today have less freedom than their mothers.
Rip away their rights. The interesting use of language there, Pelosi. I wonder what action with regards to reproductive rights, as you call them, involves violently ripping something away. I can't imagine. I can't possibly imagine. She gives credit to Mitch McConnell there because, of course, they can't resist dunking on him. But realistically, no conservative is giving McConnell credit for this one. Any Senate Majority Leader worth half their salt would have ultimately gone along with any of the judges nominated by President Trump. So Mitch McConnell really just happened to be the man who was there, the right place, the right time. But I love that long pause where you can tell she's like trying to fake cry, but she just can't do it because she's so old. But it just,
the tears just wouldn't come.
They just wouldn't come. One last one here. This is a bonus. When I heard this, I could not stop laughing. This is Senator Chris Coons.
I'm also concerned about their ambition to knock out the underpinnings of the administrative state, the ability of the federal government to provide for clean air and clean water, for safe baby formula, and for access to safe food and safe working space.
What? So by outlawing Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court is going to take away your clean air and clean water? Oh my God! This is like dystopian novel kicked into overdrive. That like literally, time skip 10 years later, the sky is dark and the rivers are running polluted with green water, all because you can't kill babies anymore. And also, baby formula? Really, Senator Coons? Your party is the reason we don't have any baby formula. What are you talking about right now, dude?
Yep. Well, this goes to their belief about Middle America. I remember back whenever there was a big debate over the Confederate monuments and all. This was like 10 years ago. On CNN, they brought on one of the sons of Confederate veterans, and they were talking about the Civil War. And the CNN host said, "Well, if the South had won, we would still have slavery. Like in the year 2010, we would still have slavery if the Confederacy had won." The New York Times just yesterday, they put out an article claiming that if because of Roe v. Wade, this now opens the door to overturn all the other due process cases, including what's the one that legalized interracial marriage way back in the 60s, Loving versus Virginia. They were claiming that this could potentially overturn that, and then certain states would make interracial marriage illegal. Like in the 2020s, in this decade, they believe, the New York Times believes that there are certain states in this day and age that would make interracial marriage illegal. But it shows the view that they have of Middle America. They view Middle America, as being a bunch of backwards hicks still stuck in the past 100 years ago. Like they don't see people as having evolved into the current era that we live in. Like I don't know if they still think that people in Middle America don't have running water or electricity, but this is their view. Like they believe that if it's not for the federal government and the courts promoting equality and defending minorities, that Middle America will oppress minorities just as bad as they did back in the 1800s.
As if Clarence Thomas is going to vote to overturn, his own marriage to his white wife. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the thing too. Exactly like you said, is that I think this ties back to their strategy when the draft was first leaked. This is what they tried to do to try to get the rest of their minority coalition, their House of Cards, diversity, multicultural coalition to care. Is that because, of course, black voters generally, when it comes to their political priorities, they don't care nearly as much about abortion. They care more about, systemic racism or whatever, possible pushes for reparations, like what we talked about, what the Biden administration did to give reparations to black farmers. They don't care nearly as much about abortion. The gay community doesn't care nearly as much about abortion. But this is the Democrats' effort to try to tie it to all the other groups in their coalition to say, oh, look, they came for abortion, so they're going to come for you next. They're going to come for your interracial marriage. They're going to come for your gay marriage. They're trying to make the rest of their coalition care about something that affects one particular segment of the coalition they've built for themselves politically. And it's not working. It didn't work then, and it's not working now. You're not going to get these voters to care. Black Lives Matter is not going to go take to the streets and riot because abortion has been overturned. It's just not going to happen.
One last thing I want to point out before we close this episode is the Roberts decision. So when news was released, the headlines I saw was 5-4. At first, I was like, wait a minute, Roberts sided with the liberal minority to not overturn Roe? Because Roberts has traditionally been one of the most at least seemingly anti-Roe justices there. And it turns out what he wanted to do was preserve the right to abortion, preserve the constitutional right to abortion, while upholding the Mississippi law and doing away with the viability argument. But the thing is, he didn't even provide a defense that there is a constitutional right for a woman to have an abortion. It's funny, he's by himself issuing this opinion, and not one single justice agreed with him on this. And Alito pointed out, like, you're not even making any argument. Ever since his Obamacare decision, his whole shtick is he's wanting to maintain the legitimacy and popular opinion of the court. He's acting as a politician rather than a justice. And this is what they did with Casey. That rather than act as justices, they acted as politicians, and they didn't feel like a majority of Americans wanted Roe to be overturned. The least he could have done is said, okay, abortion should be a constitutional right. Here's why, bullet points, but he didn't make that minimal effort.
It really is embarrassing, too, that he is the Chief Justice. Like, we realistically...
It is, yes.
I mean, again, with this supermajority we have, as Pelosi said, this supermajority of conservatives, Republican-appointed justices we have on the court, that realistically, it's thank God we don't need Roberts anymore. It's 6-3, technically, 5-4 at this point. The real ideological Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is Justice Clarence Thomas, and that is so beautiful. You really could... The Shadow Chief Justice, I guess, would be a cool-sounding nickname for him at this point. But yeah, it should be someone else. This guy is such a joke. He's a Bush appointee, of course, so no wonder he's so terrible. But realistically, it should be Justice Thomas, or maybe even Alito at this point, because again, this was Alito's decision, ultimately. But yeah, he is just such an embarrassment. He can't stop making a fool out of himself. He wanted to basically eat his cake and have it too, which is just... typical of anybody affiliated with the Bushes at this point. Oh, again, not Alito. Alito was also appointed by Bush, and he is amazing. So we got to take.
Well, I will say about Alito is a libertarian ideologue. So he's one of these libertarians that he's going to stick to his libertarian philosophy regardless of political pressure who appointed him.
Hopefully, it seems at the very least that Justices Thomas and Alito, who are both in like their early to mid 70s, have a good 10, maybe 15 years left each before they ultimately retire or what have you. So we've got, and of course Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and Barrett are all on the younger side of things as well. So it's gonna be so good. What other cases could come up? Because as we talked about, this was hinted at in the ruling. Justice Thomas said this. He referenced Obergefell by name. And let me go ahead and pull up the screenshot here Quote, for that reason, in future cases, we should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, Lawrence, and, wait for it, Obergefell, the 2015 ruling that declared same-sex marriage as a right and is legal in the United States. Can you imagine, maybe this is getting a little too ahead of ourselves, Jacob, but can you imagine Obergefell being overturned in another 5 to 10 years?
Well, that would be fantastic, but what's funny is Griswold, which is that rule gay sex is legal, but a state can't criminalize it. Of course, obviously, no state is going to criminalize it in the 21st century, but just the terror that this is going to create in the hearts and minds of homosexual leftists is just going to be fantastic. Because, I mean, honestly, that's not an issue for the courts, it's an issue for the states, and it's up to the state legislatures. And this is one thing that not enough people are saying to the lefties. It's like, look, okay, if you have strong feelings about abortion, go take it up with your state legislator. Maybe you'll actually learn their name. Because most people don't have any idea what the name is of their state senator. They don't know their state House member. They don't know any of that because everything is so federalized.
Exactly, yeah, and become a little more politically involved and informed. This is truly, again, I can't emphasize how great this is. This is truly a great historic day. I can't believe that I'm seeing it. A lot of us never thought it would happen, but it is here, and we are still enjoying the salt and the absolute moaning and wailing and gnashing of teeth that is coming from the left and the feminists gathered at the Supreme Court. I had friends who were at the Supreme Court when it was announced, and it was mostly the pro-lifers who were there at first, and it was just celebratory champagne. I saw one video of someone actually opening a champagne bottle and spraying it around in the crowd after they announced it. It was a truly, truly great thing. And again, thank you to President Trump for making this happen, and let's just imagine that even more things like this can be done in the future. And that is all the time we have left for this celebratory edition of The Right Take. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to follow us for all of our latest content at our website, righttakepodcast.com. The full list of podcast platforms and social media sites where we are available, righttakepodcast.com/subscribe. And as always, guys, if you are feeling ever so generous and want to help the show in any way you can, righttakepodcast.com/support. We'll talk to you next week, guys.